Can you believe that for 3,000 years, a single, monolithic civilization dominated the consciousness of the entire ancient world, only to vanish so completely that its greatest monuments were literally swallowed by the relentless, hungry desert sand? This is not just a historical account of kings and dusty tombs. This is the definitive, terrifying chronicle of humanity's first true superpower, a power so absolute it believed it could cheat death, defy the gods, and survive the end of time itself. We are about to dive deep into the treacherous, shimmering heart of the Nile Valley, where the scorching sun meets the endless black land, to witness the chaotic, mythical birth, the impossible golden ages, the terrifying collapses, and the final catastrophic defeat of ancient Egypt. Prepare yourself, because 3,000 years is a staggering, overwhelming burden of history that few civilizations have ever had to carry. And the weight of that legacy ultimately crushed them. Before the colossal pyramids pierced the deep blue sky, before the mighty Ramses II carved his name into every stone of the land, there was only the roaring, unpredictable river and the desperate, brutal struggle for survival in the pre-dynastic shadows. Two separate, warring kingdoms, the Red Land of the north and the White Land of the south, constantly tore at each other's throats in an unending, bloody conflict over the narrow strip of fertile mud along the banks. This was an age of cosmic anarchy, of Isfet, where life was cheap and order was a desperate, fleeting dream. A catastrophe no one saw coming, a total societal collapse before it had even begun, was only averted by the sheer, unimaginable force of will of one man, a legendary figure, perhaps a myth, known to us only as Menes, or possibly Narmer, the Scorpion King, the first true pharaoh, who decided that chaos was no longer acceptable and forged a nation in the crucible of war. When this foundational ruler stood upon the newly unified battlefield, the double crown, representing the mastery of both Upper and Lower Egypt, fixed upon his sweating brow, he didn't merely conquer a region or redraw a map. He didn't just establish a dynasty. He birthed an ideology that would sustain itself fiercely and desperately for 30 full centuries. The absolute, inviolable truth that the pharaoh was not a mere man, but a living, breathing god. He was the divine falcon god Horus, made instantly manifest in flesh, sent by the cosmic forces to maintain Ma'at, perfect divine order, against the horrifying eternal threat of oblivion and disorder. This monumental, terrifying responsibility meant that the pharaoh could never falter. His failure would mean the return of the blackness, the collapse of the sun, and the utter destruction of Egypt itself. This was the founding myth, the terrifying promise that held the entire civilization together, and it demanded permanence. It demanded monuments that defied nature, monuments that would last forever, literally mocking the finite nature of human life. The early dynastic period, 3100–2686 BC, was not subtle. It was a furious, relentless 400-year sprint toward immortality and incomprehensible scale. They started building massive mastabas, vast rectangular tombs of mud brick that looked more like fortified palaces than final resting places. These structures were designed not just to hold the body of the deceased god-king, but to serve as the massive engine powering his soul's journey into the afterlife, ensuring that he could continue to govern the living world from the realm of the dead. They filled these tombs with staggering wealth, sacrificed retainers, and enough provisions to run a small city for eternity, all because the continuity of the divine order, Ma'at, depended entirely on the pharaoh's successful transition. If he failed, the Nile would dry up, the enemies would swarm the borders, and the very sky would fall. The pressure to succeed was crushing, terrifying, and total. But these mastabas were simply not grand enough. They were temporary. They were made of mud brick, which was vulnerable to the devastating annual floods and the ceaseless, corrosive wind of the desert. The early pharaohs knew, deep in their bones, that mud brick might last a few hundred years, but they were planning for millennia. Their ambition was not temporal, it was geological. And so the world pivoted on the razor's edge of the Third Dynasty, around 2686 BC, when a revolutionary idea, fueled by unimaginable resources and manpower, swept through the royal court. The idea was simple, but the execution was historically impossible. They would abandon soft mud and build entirely in stone. They would build something so permanent, so geometrically perfect, that even the gods would marvel at its unwavering solidity. This required a genius, a visionary who could transform their desperate ambition into solid, eternal reality. Enter Imhotep, architect, physician, priest, and vizier to Pharaoh Djoser. This singular, towering figure would become the first historically attested genius in human history. The man who dared to stack one stone upon another, then another, then another, until the mastaba was no longer a rectangle. It was a mountain. It was the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, the world's first colossal stone building. Standing 200 feet high, it was a terrifying, intimidating declaration to the entire known world. Egypt had the power, the wealth, and the divine mandate to build structures that would outlive the very stars. This wasn't just architecture. It was solidified physical theology, a staircase for the divine pharaoh to ascend directly back to the sun god Ra. This single, revolutionary structure shattered all previous limitations. It ushered in the age of the god-kings, the era of absolute centralized power, and the foundation of what history calls the Old Kingdom, the Pyramid Age. They had tasted permanence, and they wanted more. They wanted perfection. They wanted the final, ultimate, terrifying monument that would define their civilization forever. But as we look ahead across the next 3,000 years, remember this terrifying truth. Even these mountains of stone, built to last an eternity, were just a temporary shield against the inevitable forces of decay. First, crippling, utterly catastrophic test of survival. A test that would tear the old kingdom down to its very foundations and plunge the Nile Valley into darkness. The shadows are gathering now, even as Djoser's pyramid shines in the sun. The architects are planning the Great Pyramid of Giza, unknowing that the moment of their greatest achievement will also signal the beginning of their most devastating, terrifying fall. The architects are planning the Great Pyramid of Giza, unknowing that the moment of their greatest achievement will also signal the beginning of their most devastating, terrifying fall. The ground is still trembling from the ambitions of the early kings, but now a new, unparalleled God walks the earth. His name is Khufu, and he demands not just a tomb, but a scar on the face of the planet itself, a mountain of limestone and sweat engineered to defy time, a monument so monumental it screams his power across millennia. They worked not as whipped slaves, as the myths often scream, but as organized masses of laborers, farmers, and skilled craftsmen, all bound by the absolute, terrifying belief in their living deity and the promise of eternal reward. They labored under the unforgiving gaze of the sun god Ra, moving 2 million blocks of stone, each weighing more than an entire modern car, setting the foundation for the 4th dynasty, the true zenith of terrifying power. The precision of the Great Pyramid was so terrifyingly advanced that they aligned this behemoth almost perfectly with the cardinal directions, a feat that baffles our most sophisticated scientists today, proving that this was not mere construction. This was an act of cosmic defiance. The entire Egyptian civilization functioned on one single, non-negotiable principle: Ma'at. This wasn't just justice or law. It was the terrifying, fragile balance of the universe, the cosmic order that held back the chaos of the desert and the darkness itself. The pharaoh was the living, breathing embodiment of Ma'at, and his actions dictated whether the Nile would flood, whether the pharaoh was the living, breathing embodiment of Ma'at, and his actions dictated whether the Nile would flood, whether the crops would grow, or whether the entire world would simply dissolve into the primordial abyss. If the pharaoh failed, the universe itself failed. This system gave him unimaginable, terrifying power. The people did not pay taxes in coinage, they paid in labor and devotion, feeding the massive state bureaucracy that oversaw everything from canal maintenance to the careful preservation of every sacred beetle. But even gods need administrators. As the pyramids grew taller, The power began to fracture, creeping away from the lone figure on the throne and into the hands of the high officials, the viziers, and the terrifyingly powerful regional governors called nomarchs. Imhotep, the original genius of the step pyramid, had shown them the blueprint for immortal architecture, but he also showed them the blueprint for immortal, self-sustaining administration. The bureaucracy became a monster, feeding on itself, demanding more resources, more loyalty, and slowly, irrevocably, eroded decentralized control that defined the old kingdom's strength. Imagine a machine so complex, so vast, that the man who built it can no longer control all of its parts. That was the terrifying reality facing the pharaohs of the later 4th and 5th dynasties. As the old kingdom matured, a subtle shift occurred, a move away from the sheer, brute force magnificence of the Giza builders toward the spiritual dominance of the sun god, Ra. We see this terrifying transition in the 5th dynasty, as the kings began to build not just pyramids, but massive, intricate sun temples, monuments dedicated purely to the solar deity. The pyramids themselves started shrinking, a clear sign that the divine energy was moving. The pharaoh was slowly becoming less of a god on earth and more of the chief priest of Ra, managing divine affairs rather than commanding physical armies of stone movers. The nomarchs, seeing this subtle dilution of central power, began to consolidate their local territories with renewed, terrifying ambition. They stopped viewing the distant king as the sole source of their authority, instead carving out hereditary power bases in their provinces, building elaborate, decorated tombs for themselves, tombs that screamed independence louder than any open rebellion could. The horrifying end began with the reign of Pepi II, the last great king of the 6th dynasty, who ruled for an impossible, unnerving 94 years. He ascended the throne as a child and lived almost a century, a reign so long that his subjects and officials died off repeatedly, leaving an aging, complacent, and ultimately powerless figurehead at the center of the collapsing empire. The terrifying longevity of Pepi II was not a blessing. It was a curse that paralyzed the nation. When he finally perished, the shock wave ripped the fragile cosmic order apart. A devastating explosion of central authority. Ma'at. Shattered. The Nile floods, which the pharaoh was supposed to guarantee through his divine connection, began to fail repeatedly due to devastating natural climate shifts, starving the heartland and proving to the masses that their god-king had utterly failed them. The central government dissolved into dust and panic. The terrifying chaos of the first intermediate period had begun, a dark age where the pyramids stood as mocking, silent monuments to a forgotten, perfect order. The unthinkable happened. The perfect, eternal machine broke. Within the span of a few generations after Pepi II's endless reign, the concept of a unified Egypt vanished entirely. The capital, Memphis, the heart of the world, was reduced to a desperate, besieged city. Writing from that era, the terrifying laments of intellectual elites details a world turned upside down. The rich man's jewelry was seized by bandits. The poor man suddenly possessed power. The noblewoman was forced to grind grain like a common servant, a complete, horrifying inversion of the divine order. Tombs were desecrated with impunity, the very foundations of eternity, the careful preparations for the afterlife that cost generations of labor, were ripped open, their treasures scattered, their mummies mutilated by desperate scavengers. This period was a terrifying experiment in anarchy, a 150-year-long nightmare, where regional warlords fought mercilessly for control of the dwindling resources, and the belief in the great Pharaoh, the living god, was replaced by localized, desperate cults of survival. The desert reclaimed its own. Sand crept over the perfect casing stones of the pyramids, covering the glorious achievements of the past, burying the memory of the unified kingdom. The terrifying silence descended upon the land, broken only by the clash of localized armies and the cries of the starving. This was the dark age they never planned for, the collapse that proved even the most powerful gods could be swallowed by the relentless hunger of time. Egypt had imploded, and the question now was not if it could be restored, but who possessed the terrifying willpower and the divine mandate to stitch the shattered pieces of Ma'at back together, to drag the world out of the abyss of chaos. The world was drowning. Chaos, Isfet, had shredded the very fabric of reality, leaving tiny, warring chiefdoms scrabbling for survival along the muddy banks of the Nile, each one terrified that the sun would simply refuse to rise the next morning. But the gods, they never truly abandon their children. They merely wait for the vessel strong enough to wield their terrifying power. And that vessel emerged from the darkness of Upper Egypt, a man whose name echoes with the sound of a universe being slammed back into alignment. Narmer. The double crown, an unbelievable masterpiece of symbolic power, was not a mere hat. It was the visible representation of Ma'at restored, the physical manifestation of political unity achieved through terrifying, unyielding force. Narmer established the capital at the precise geographical pivot point, the place where the river fractured, naming it Eneb Hedge, the White Walls. Later, we would know it as Memphis, the city that would define Egyptian power for millennia, born from a single terrifying vision of cosmic order and fortified by the deepest belief in centralized power. Now, the sheer scale of what happened next is why you must understand the crucial difference between a king and a pharaoh. A king rules land. A pharaoh is the land. He was the chief priest, the commander-in-chief, the supreme judge, and the single, solitary conduit through which the gods communicated with humanity, ensuring the continuous flow of divine grace necessary for the inundation and the harvest. This required an immediate, massive expansion of the state apparatus, a bureaucratic skeleton built to support a god. Suddenly, there was a desperate need for hundreds of scribes, for tax collectors capable of tracking the movement of every sack of grain, for highly specialized administrators capable of predicting the annual flood cycle, managing grain reserves, and mobilizing tens of thousands of laborers at a moment's notice. The foundation of the great bureaucratic machine, the machine that would eventually lift the pyramids toward the stars, was being poured in the silt of the first and second dynasties, long before Khufu ever dreamed of limestone. The borders had to be secured, not just against raiding tribes from the Libyan desert or the turbulent south, but against the very possibility of chaos creeping back in through the cracks. Fortresses sprang up like divine teeth, silent watchers guarding the gates of the fertile valley. But the most important fortification was the one built around the pharaoh himself, the doctrine of absolute divine kingship, which mandated that his life was literally tied to the prosperity of the entire nation. Every Egyptian citizen, from the humblest peasant to the highest vizier, understood that the pharaoh was not merely chosen by the gods, he was a god. Specifically, the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon deity, ensuring the continuous, flawless rotation of the cosmos and the defeat of the chaotic Seth. When he died, he became Osiris, lord of the underworld, guaranteeing eternal life for his people, and the next Horus immediately took his place on the throne. This cycle was the immutable engine of stability, a theological commitment to absolute, perpetual, centralized power that lasted 3,000 years. It meant that every command, every tax levy, every mobilization order was not a political request open to debate. It was a divine decree, utterly unchallengeable and enforceable by the highest celestial powers. For centuries, the early pharaohs, while achieving remarkable feats of irrigation and administrative control, were buried in relatively modest mud-brick mastabas, massive rectangular structures that hinted at the ambition to come, but lacked the raw, terrifying permanence of stone. They were practicing. They were experimenting with logistics, with labor management, with the sheer physics of moving mountains of earth. Then came the moment. The world stopped holding its breath. The moment the old kingdom, the true age of pharaohs, the unparalleled zenith of divine power, exploded onto the scene, transforming the desert landscape forever. We call it the Pyramid Age, but it was really the age of absolute control, where human effort was channeled into one singular cosmic goal, ensuring the pharaoh's ascent to the stars, thereby preserving the world. Enter Pharaoh Djoser, a man whose ambition could only be contained by granite, and his legendary vizier, Imhotep. Imhotep. Remember that name, because he was more than a mere official. He was the Leonardo da Vinci of the ancient world, an astronomer, a physician, and the world's first known genius architect, an innovator whose brilliance fundamentally altered reality. Djoser challenged Imhotep: create a burial monument that did not just protect the body, but actively launched the Ka, life force, into the eternal sky, a permanent nexus between heaven and earth. Imhotep looked at the traditional mud brick mastaba, and he saw a limitation. He saw fragility. He saw earthbound mortality. His solution was staggering in its simplicity and radical in its execution. Stack the mastabas one upon the other 6 times, shrinking slightly with each ascending step, creating a colossal stairway to heaven made of gleaming, permanent limestone. This was the step pyramid at Saqqara, the world's first monumental structure built entirely of cut stone, a revolution carved in rock. It wasn't just a tomb. It was a cosmic engine, a revolution in mathematics, engineering, and state theology. The complex surrounding Djoser's pyramid was a massive enclosed city built for eternity, designed for the Pharaoh's immortal spirit to continue ruling Egypt and managing the cosmos from the afterlife. The sheer organization required to quarry, transport, and assemble millions of tons of stone, forcing perfect angles and flawless symmetry across the landscape, was a testament to the iron grip of the central authority that Narmer had established centuries before. This monument was the physical proof that Ma'at was restored, that the chaos was utterly defeated, and that the pharaoh possessed truly divine, limitless power. The step pyramid did more than just start the old kingdom. It provided the terrifying, undeniable blueprint for every single monumental achievement that followed. It screamed into the desert wind, "We are immortal. We are untouchable. We are Egypt." And the world watched in stunned silence as the greatest architectural age in human history began to unfold, driven by the absolute, fundamental belief that the men sitting on the throne were quite literally living gods walking among the mortals. And so, with the cosmic mandate ringing in the dry desert air, the stage was set for the most terrifyingly ambitious building project in all of human antiquity. These gods, these living embodiments of Horus, could not simply die and be buried in a hole. They needed a beacon, a stairway to the heavens, a monument so vast that it would scream their divinity across the millennia. The moment the crown touched the head of a new pharaoh, the construction clock started ticking, a race against mortality itself. Their eternal home had to be ready, perfectly aligned with the stars, before their divine heart stopped beating. This terrifying urgency drove the early architects to conceive of things that should have been physically impossible in that era. We are now plunging head first into the Old Kingdom, roughly 2686 BC, the undisputed golden age of absolute, centralized power. This was not merely an era of construction, it was an era of cosmic engineering. The first true leap came under the rule of Pharaoh Djoser, but the true genius, the man whose name should echo louder than almost any other was Imhotep. He was the Grand Vizier, physician, and chief architect, a man so ahead of his time that future generations would eventually deify him, mistaking his genius for magic. Imhotep looked at the traditional mud brick mastaba, a flat bench-like tomb, and scoffed. He declared, "We will not build with temporary earth. We will build with the very bedrock of creation." Djoser's monument at Saqqara wasn't just big. It was the world's first colossal structure built entirely of cut stone. The step pyramid, rising 6 massive layers into the sky, was the prototype, the explosive blueprint that changed the world forever. Imagine the sheer terror and awe of the average Egyptian farmer, seeing the synthetic mountain rise from the sand for the first time, proof positive that their ruler was truly otherworldly. But the step pyramid was merely a rehearsal. The architects hadn't yet achieved the perfect mathematical form that the sun god Ra demanded. They needed the smooth slope, the geometric purity of the solar rays made solid. This quest for the perfect, terrifyingly smooth structure fell to Pharaoh Sneferu, the founder of the 4th dynasty, and he was an absolute maniac for building. Sneferu was not satisfied with one eternal home. He effectively built 3, turning the entire Egyptian treasury toward the obsession of immortality. His first attempt, the Pyramid Apmetum, collapsed spectacularly, or perhaps was deliberately abandoned after a structural catastrophe. His second attempt, the famous Bent Pyramid at Dashur, stands as a testament to engineering panic. Halfway through the construction, the engineers realized the angle was too steep, a staggering 54 degrees, and the weight was collapsing the internal chambers. They had to frantically change the slope mid-build, bending the profile down to a safer 43 degrees. It is a scar of failure, frozen forever in stone, demonstrating that even living gods could make catastrophic mistakes. But Sneferu, driven by divine paranoia, refused to quit. He learned from the horror, calculated the physics anew, and finally completed the Red Pyramid, the first true, smooth-sided pyramid. This single success paved the way for the terrifying crescendo, the moment when the power of the pharaohs reached its absolute zenith, the Age of Giza. Sneferu's son, Khufu, ascended the throne, and he did not just want a pyramid. He demanded the largest object ever constructed by human hands. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is not merely a tomb. It is an astronomical observatory, a geological impossibility, and a mind-numbing mathematical equation carved into the earth. For 20 years, 100,000 men worked in 3-month shifts, moving blocks weighing up to 80 tons, all without the use of the wheel, complex pulleys, or iron tools. Think about that number. 2.3 million blocks of limestone, each perfectly quarried, transported across the Nile, dragged up massive earthen ramps, and placed with such precision that the average gap between the stones is thinner than a piece of paper. Khufu's pyramid is so immense that even today, centuries of looting, erosion, and the sheer weight of time have barely scratched its surface. It contains enough stone to build a wall 10 feet high, stretching all the way around France. And yet, the tragedy is already written in the sand. Khufu, the most powerful man on earth, who commanded mountains to be moved, left no lasting record of himself. There is almost nothing known about his reign except for the colossal monument to his ego. His son, Khafre, built the second Great Pyramid and, more famously, commissioned the Great Sphinx, a creature of staggering, silent mystery. It sits there, guarding the necropolis, staring eternally eastward toward the rising sun, the ultimate symbol of the Pharaoh's dual nature, man and celestial beast. The Sphinx's face is believed to be that of Khafre himself, immortalizing his gaze across 4,500 years, a gaze that says, "I was here, I was a god, and I will never be forgotten." Yet, even as these mountains of eternity reached their peak, the seeds of collapse were already being sown. The cost of this monumental, God-driven construction was staggering. The sheer resource drain on the centralized state, the constant need for manpower, food storage, materials, and administrative overhead was unsustainable. The pharaohs were achieving immortality in stone, but they were slowly bankrupting the life force of the kingdom itself. The power, once absolute, began to fracture. The provincial governors, the nomarchs, who managed the distant territories and ensured the flow of goods to Giza, started to gain localized power, growing rich and influential, far from the pharaoh's eye. The divine mandate that built the pyramids would eventually be the very thing that shattered the old kingdom into 1,000 pieces. The age of pyramids was the high watermark, a beautiful, terrifying crescendo before the inevitable, devastating crash. The gods had built their stairways, but the stairs were far too expensive to maintain. And when the centralized control faltered, the desert winds began their slow, patient work of reclamation. The sand was waiting. The magnificent edifice of the Old Kingdom, that monolithic structure built on the absolute divinity of the pharaoh, did not crumble gently. It detonated. When the endless river of gold and grain stopped flowing from the nomes into the centralized treasury at Memphis, the priests of Ra and the army of bureaucrats suddenly found themselves starving, their orders carrying no weight beyond the walls of their immediate district. This was not a slow decline, but a cosmic catastrophe that instantly tore the veil of eternity and revealed the pharaoh to be nothing more than a wealthy man, now stripped bare. The unimaginable happened. The divine mouth fell silent, and the concept of ma'at, cosmic balance, order, and truth, was utterly annihilated. replaced by the terrifying, hungry void of Isfet, the primordial chaos the Egyptians feared above all else. This dark century and a half is known to history as the First Intermediate Period, a terrifying, fragmented era where the greatest civilization on Earth dissolved into a nightmare of petty, warring kingdoms and localized terror. The collapse was immediate and localized. The nomarchs, the local governors who once served as the pharaoh's humble servants, looked at their own well-stocked granaries, their own local militias, and the vast, defenseless stretch of the Nile that flowed through their territory, and they all simultaneously realized the terrifying truth. The king was dead. Long live the 1,000 kings. These ambitious local rulers stopped sending taxes north, seizing control of the vital irrigation works, and immediately turning their local military might against their neighbors. The civil war that erupted was not fought over ideology, but over the most basic necessity of life: arable land, irrigation rights, and the increasingly scarce grain stores following what seemed to have been successive, punishing periods of drought that mocked the pharaoh's inability to control the heavens. Texts from this period are heartbreaking, etched in desperation onto coffin lids and temple walls. They speak of the dead being thrown into the Nile, of men eating their own children out of starvation, and of brother killing brother for a single loaf of bread. The mighty pyramids stood as hollow, mocking monuments to an age of stability that would never return, their eternal stone now serving only as a grim reminder of how far they had fallen. The power vacuum became a relentless, grinding conflict that divided the length of the country, pitting the fragmented 9th and 10th dynasties, ruling loosely from Heracleopolis in the north, against a new, terrifyingly ambitious power base that had emerged far to the south, in the dusty, neglected city of Waset, a city we now call Thebes. The Heracleopolitans claimed the legitimate lineage, clinging desperately to the Memphite traditions, but they were weak, constantly threatened by incursions from the Delta, and unable to extend their control past Middle Egypt. Meanwhile, the Theban family, the fearsome lineage of the Intef kings, were consolidating their power with ruthless efficiency. The Thebans were rugged, hardened by constant skirmishes against the Nubian tribes to the south, and their worship was focused not on the gentle sun god Ra, but on the aggressive local war deity Montu, who demanded order through brute force and military victory. They were hungry, they were centralized, and they had a singular, violent goal: crush the north and stitch a land back together, piece by bloody piece. The ensuing conflict lasted generations, a brutal war of attrition fought along the 22nd nome, the borderlands where nomarchs constantly switched allegiance based on who could offer the most land or the swift end to their enemies. Fortresses were built and destroyed, cities besieged, and the dream of unified Egypt seemed to fade further with every single death. The true titan who finally emerged from this crucible of civil war was Mentuhotep II. His name echoes with the sound of destiny and iron, the ultimate warrior king. He spent decades systematically subduing the nomarchs of Upper Egypt, ensuring absolute loyalty before finally turning his sights on the northern pretenders. His campaign was not subtle diplomacy. It was a devastating, total war. The archaeological record shows evidence of mass graves, soldiers buried in their fighting poses, brutally slain in the final, climactic battles against the Heracleobalitan forces. The most famous discovery was near his own future mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, where 60 soldiers were buried, wrapped in linen, their shields still resting beside them, testament to the cost of reunification. The moment of final victory came when Mentuhotep II's armies sacked the Heracleopolitan capital. The northern resistance was utterly annihilated, their temples destroyed, their claim extinguished in fire and smoke. Mentuhotep II was not just a king, he was a revolutionary, a violent restorer of Ma'at, and the founder of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt's golden age. But the kingship he established was fundamentally different from the Old Kingdom's divine isolation. The new pharaoh was no longer a distant, serene god floating above the world. He was a hard-edged warrior, a shepherd of his people, whose face was etched with the grim responsibility of maintaining order in a world he knew could shatter at any moment. The art of the Middle Kingdom reflects this profound shift. Where Old Kingdom statues showed placid, timeless serenity, the statues of kings like Senusret III display worry lines, deep-set eyes, and an expression of profound weariness, a constant reminder of the chaos they had clawed their way out of. To solidify his new reign, Mentuhotep II chose a new capital, moving power from the ancient, polluted memory of Memphis and establishing the administrative center near Thebes, a town he called Ichtawi, Caesar of the Two Lands, near the entrance to the Fayum. This new location marked a deliberate break from the past, embracing the rugged military strength of the South and creating a powerful, centralized government that learned the horrifying lesson of the FIP. Control must be absolute, bureaucracy must be efficient, and the cost of order, no matter how great, was always cheaper than the price of letting the sand swallow the state whole. The terrifying ghost of the First Intermediate Period would haunt the memory of every pharaoh for the next 2,000 years. The ghost of the First Intermediate Period, that terrifying specter of 2 centuries of starvation and civil war, was not exorcised by prayer or ritual, but by blood and pure, unadulterated steel. The chaos had been absolute. The realization that the divine pharaoh was just a man whose head could be separated from his crown was a wound that cut to the very soul of the Egyptian belief system. The darkness had swallowed the light, but the Nile, eternal and relentless, demanded a master, and a master finally rose from the deep, forgotten south. The savior did not emerge from the ruined palaces of Memphis, the ancient capital that had watched the Old Kingdom commit suicide. He came from Waset, a dusty, turbulent town that would rise to become the spiritual heart of the world, the place the Greeks would later call Thebes. His name was Mentuhotep II, a warlord of the 11th dynasty, and he was the fist that crushed anarchy. Mentuhotep did not just declare himself king. He performed a terrifying ritual reenactment of the ancient triumph of Narmer, symbolically stamping out the last flames of division. But this new pharaoh, scarred by the memory of collapse, carried a fundamentally different understanding of power than his ancestors. The Old Kingdom pharaohs were remote, aloof gods, Ra incarnate, whose mere existence ensured cosmic order, Ma'at. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs, however, knew the state could fracture, the people could starve, and the nobles could rebel. They carried the deep scars of the FIP, and while they were still divine, their role shifted. The new king was the shepherd of his people, the steward of the land. His divinity was now earned through tireless administrative effort and military ruthlessness, not just birthright. He was accountable. This profound shift was cemented under the powerful 12th dynasty, particularly the brilliant and terrifying administrators Amenemhat I and Senusret III. Egypt was transformed into a machine of maximum efficiency, focused relentlessly on resource extraction and absolute border defense. The strategic focus pivoted south, down the Nile, toward the resource-rich, fiercely independent lands of Nubia. The gold mines were not merely valuable. They were the indispensable treasury of the entire kingdom, funding the colossal irrigation projects and the defensive garrisons that secured the state. Senusret III was the physical manifestation of this new warrior-shepherd persona. He launched invasion after invasion into Nubia, personally leading his armies beyond the treacherous Second Cataract, establishing the massive, terrifying fortification complex at Buhen. These forts were not simple watchtowers. They were miniature, self-sustaining cities, garrisoned by hardened veterans, designed to project Egyptian power deep into the African interior and maintain an iron grip on the flow of precious metals, incense, and exotic woods. The inscriptions left behind at Buhen warned all outsiders: cross this boundary and face immediate, irreversible destruction. To the north, the delta was secured against the increasing presence of Asiatic peoples seeking grazing land and opportunity in the fertile land of Goshen. Amenemhat I commissioned the construction of the formidable Walls of the Ruler, a chain of massive fortresses designed to hermetically seal off the delta's eastern approaches. This was a strategic paranoia born of past mistakes. They were building a fortress state, determined that the outside world would never again be allowed to breach the sacred isolation of the Nile Valley. They understood the price of weakness, and they would not pay it again. But the greatest triumph of the Middle Kingdom was not measured in stone or gold. It was measured in words. The security provided by these iron-fisted kings allowed for an explosion of cultural and literary creativity unlike anything seen before. For the first time, Egyptian scribes moved beyond the dry rituals and the formulaic, repetitive praise of the pharaoh. They began to explore the human condition, the moral dilemmas of power, and the complex relationship between fate, justice, and personal suffering. The masterpieces poured forth, the tale of the eloquent peasant, a stunning legal drama that argued passionately for justice regardless of social status, and the chilling Instruction of Amenemhat, where the assassinated pharaoh warns his son against trusting anyone, revealing the deep political cynicism that underlay the Golden Age's stability. And then there was the story of Sinuhe, arguably the most famous piece of Egyptian literature ever written. It told the epic tale of a court official who flees Egypt after witnessing a royal murder, only to spend years wandering as a triumphant warrior in foreign lands, suffering crippling, existential homesickness. Sinuhe's ultimate return to Egypt, his forgiveness by the pharaoh, and his intense preparation for burial on sacred soil defined the powerful national identity of this era. Only in Egypt, beneath the direct, stabilizing gaze of the gods, could true peace and eternal life be found. The literature of the Middle Kingdom revealed a profound truth. The Egyptians now understood the fragility of Ma'at. They were no longer naive. They knew order was not automatic. It was a daily, painful battle against the forces of chaos, Isfet. This profound philosophical depth cemented the Middle Kingdom's legacy. It was a time of magnificent power, yes, but also a time of deep self-reflection, where the pharaoh was not just a symbol, but an active, accountable steward, a builder of systems that would sustain life. They built vast, complex irrigation systems known as the Fayum Project, transforming an arid basin into a colossal reservoir, exponentially increasing arable land and feeding a booming population that strained the limits of the Nile Valley's resources. They were planning for the next 1,000 years, believing they had finally cracked the code of political and divine immortality. But the cycle, that terrifying, unstoppable pattern of rise, peak, and collapse, was already winding its gears. Even the most ruthless administrators and the most brilliant poets could not guard against the slow, creeping disease of decentralization that comes from too much success. As the 12th dynasty faded, the system began to choke on its own complexity. The sheer administrative burden of the Fayum, the Nubian forts, and the Delta defenses proved exhausting. The once loyal nomarchs, benefiting from the long stability, began to reclaim local authority, passing titles and power down their own lines, ignoring the central government. The powerful position of vizier, the pharaoh's right hand, grew too large, too influential, dominating weak subsequent kings. Slowly, subtly, the iron grip of the central Theban government began to loosen, leading Egypt toward another abyss, another terrifying moment of weakness that the outside world was waiting, ready to exploit. The shadow of the Second Intermediate Period was falling, cast by a mysterious foreign power that would shatter the Golden Age, rule the sacred land of the Nile from their own separate throne, and usher in the greatest humiliation in Egyptian history. A moment where the divine land was conquered by barbarians on chariots. The humiliation was absolute. The Hyksos, these alien kings, had planted their flag deep in the delta, establishing the foreign capital of Avaris and demanding tribute from the humbled Egyptian princes trapped in the south. This was the Dark Age of the Second Intermediate Period, a catastrophic century when the world's first superpower was reduced to a vassal state, its divine mandate shattered into 1,000,000 pieces beneath the hoofs of barbarian chariots. But in the deep south, cradled by the mountainous majesty of Thebes, the sacred flame of true Egyptian royalty still flickered, a tiny ember protected by the god Amun. They were a dynasty of shadows, nursing a cold, lethal vengeance, plotting the precise, lethal moment they would rise from the desert dust to reclaim the sacred promise of the two lands. Their revenge would not just liberate Egypt, it would forge an empire. His sacrifice became the ultimate propaganda, the martyr fuel needed to ignite the war machine that had been dormant for 100 years. His son, Kamose, inherited the throne and the sacred duty of expulsion, a general driven by absolute fury, viewing the Hyksos not merely as political rivals, but as a defilement upon the divine soil of Horus. Kamose famously rejected the counsel of his terrified advisors, who urged caution and maintaining the fragile, degrading peace that kept the tribute flowing north. He declared with fire in his voice that no true pharaoh could rest while foreign hordes controlled the lifeblood of the Nile, the very gateway to the Mediterranean world. He launched a massive, coordinated attack, pushing north with the speed and ferocity of a desert windstorm, shattering the uneasy truce and pushing the Hyksos back onto their heels in a moment of terrifying, glorious resurgence. Kamose began the storm, but it would take one final, magnificent hero to seal the victory and usher in the Golden Age. That hero was Amos I, the younger brother, the founder of the monumental 18th dynasty and the absolute architect of the new kingdom. He was not just fighting a war, he was initiating a cosmic rebirth, an explosion of power and ambition that would define the next 500 years of civilization and forever change the face of the ancient world. Amos learned the enemy's most lethal tricks, adopting their advanced weaponry, especially the horse-drawn chariot, the very instrument of their shame, and turning it against them with brutal, uncompromising effectiveness. The siege of Avaris was an epical moment, a 4-year grind of relentless warfare that saw the Hyksos finally broken, their capital city utterly consumed by the righteous fury of the newly unified Egyptian army. They were not just defeated, they were totally ejected, chased out of the delta, and pursued deep into southern Canaan to ensure they never dared look south again. their power base utterly dismantled and salted into the earth. With the foreign threat neutralized, Ahmose unified the land with iron precision, casting out the petty local rulers who had grown too powerful during the preceding chaos, and claiming all power for the throne in Thebes. But he did more than just unify. He fundamentally redefined the scope of the pharaoh's role and ambition. Never again would Egypt be merely a wealthy kingdom. It would be an empire, an irresistible, conquering juggernaut, determined to impose its divine order upon every corner of the known world. This was the seismic moment the world shifted on its axis. The new kingdom, the golden age, the age of empire, the time of Tutankhamun, Hatshepsut, and Ramesses the Great, had dawned in a torrent of blood and glory, built entirely on the smoldering, unforgettable ruins of national shame and vengeance. The trauma of the Hyksos occupation left an indelible scar, a driving, necessary paranoia that fueled their new imperial policy. Defensive expansion, the belief that to protect Egypt, they must control everything outside Egypt's borders. The borders were pushed deep into the gold-rich lands of Nubia in the south, seeking the resources and labor needed to fuel massive new temple projects and monumental constructions that dwarfed the works of the Old Kingdom. Simultaneously, the armies drove far into the hostile Levant in the north, establishing vital buffer zones, trade routes, and demanding absolute fealty from every minor king and chieftain in the region. Pharaoh became the ultimate warrior king, personally leading vast armies into battle. His divine authority now backed by the most professional and lethal military machine the world had yet encountered. The military structure was overhauled, professionalized, and equipped with the finest bronze weapons the greatest minds could forge. The immense spoils of war flooded Thebes, turning it into the richest, most breathtaking city on the planet, a glittering, sun-drenched testament to the newly restored and magnified divine power of Amun-Ra. The sheer volume of wealth and conquest demanded a corresponding increase in infrastructure and, critically, religious justification for this world domination. The god Amun, who had been elevated as the patron of Thebes during the dark years of the Hyksos era, was now fused with the supreme ancient sun god Ra, creating the undisputed titan Amun-Ra, the king of the gods. This powerful, theologically absolute shift solidified Theban dominance and justified the pharaoh's absolute, world-conquering authority to every priest, noble, and peasant. The message broadcast across the empire was clear, carved in stone and gold. The pharaoh wasn't just ruling Egypt. He was executing the terrifying, cosmic will of Amun-Ra, making him the divine administrator of the cosmos, with the absolute right to demand tribute from every lesser king, from the distant Euphrates River to the forbidding fourth cataract of the Nile. Then, just as the titanic new empire stabilized and the world recognized Egyptian supremacy, a challenge arose that shattered 3 millennia of tradition and religious law. A woman, ascended to the golden throne. Thutmose I had been a great warrior, pushing the empire to its territorial limits, but his designated heir, Thutmose II, died tragically young, leaving behind only a child, the boy king, Thutmose III. Into this gaping, dangerous power vacuum stepped Hatshepsut, the great royal wife and powerful daughter of the great Thutmose I. Initially acting merely as regent for the boy king, her ambition was too vast, her grasp of political power too firm, to simply relinquish control. Within 7 years, she executed the most unprecedented and audacious move in Egyptian history. She declared herself pharaoh, not queen, but the living, breathing king of Upper and Lower Egypt.